Autism isn't just a dipping sauce that occasionally interacts with your nuggets and fries of your thoughts. Autism is also the nuggets, the plate, it's the whole freaking restaurant. During the early stages of discovering that I was autistic, I was truly shocked to grasp how much autism affected every single aspect of my life. When talking about autism, we usually over-focus on what's externally observable, but autism doesn't just affect what I do or what I think, but greatly affects how I think. With that realization, I will be covering some obscure and lesser known internalized traits in autism. And at the end of the video, I'll be giving some helpful and realistic advice to cope with some of the difficulties that come with having a neurospicy brain. Welcome to those of you who are new. I'm Andrew, Drew for short. Please consider subscribing for more high quality content on high quality topics. As always, this channel is a safe place for thoughtful discussion, so please be respectful in the comments below. Let's cover the obvious but necessary disclaimers here. These traits are not proof that you are or are not autistic, and even though these traits do relate to a lot of the neurodivergent community, that doesn't mean neurotypicals can't relate, nor does it mean that you aren't autistic if you don't relate to everything. With that out of the way, let's begin with those obscure and lesser known traits that many autistic individuals experience. The first, and probably my least favorite on this list, is perfectionism. I have been a chronic perfectionist my whole life, and despite my life being littered with straight A's, extracurriculars, social success, and accomplishments, perfectionism is a chronic problem that robs me of a lot of satisfaction. To a degree that's not only over the top, but actually interrupts my daily life, even down to the mundane. In every decision I make, I feel like somewhere out in the universe, written in the stars, is the correct answer for any and all situations. If I were to just think about something long enough, it would only be a matter of time before I can and will reach this correct cosmic conclusion. Which leads into hyper efficiency. Everything has to be perfectly optimized or efficient. For example, I can't go to the store for one item. It always has to be an extremely efficient route of travel that hits up multiple errands. Or even before I hop in the shower, I have to perfectly plan out if I'm doing any activities that would make me sweat, when was the last time I washed my hair, when my first social activity of the day is, and you may be thinking, everyone does that. Everyone plans. Everyone would pick what's convenient. What we're looking for isn't if you relate or not, but rather if there's irregularities or extremes in how deeply or how much you relate to autistic thinking and traits. So yes, I think a majority of people will pick a convenient errand run that hits multiple strings of events in a convenient and neat order. But for me, I won't do something if it's not perfectly optimal and efficient. I'll also spend exorbitant amounts of time on the wrong things. Even something as simple as ordering a sandwich, I am paralyzed with indecision. I am carefully calculating the most optimal sandwich order. What tastes the best? What do I get? How much should I get? I somehow have to precisely guess the correct amount of food to feel full. What quantity is right? What if I try something new? What if I don't like the new thing? That new risk now outweighs the potential of something being good. There's this ratio of what is the most filling and tasty, but also inexpensive. This process gets even worse for me when I have access to more options or more information about the options. So pretty much every time I order something online, whenever I order something cheap and stupid, I will then proceed to spend 2 to 5 hours researching every possible comparable product, when in reality, both the decision and the process of ordering should only take me 5 minutes. At the end of it, I will then know the competitors, the trending price ranges, quality, reviews, where the product was manufactured, or if I should just make this thing myself. And even then, I may still be too indecisive to actually hit purchase. I often find myself spending way too much time on the things that don't actually matter, and end up putting way too much time and energy into something that should really require very little attention. Next up, have you ever been described as having a kind, gentle personality, but also having an extremely explosive temper that is almost considered out of character. You might even be described as having a destructive temper, but really 99% of the time, you're viewed as someone with a calm, peaceful, and reasonable demeanor. In truth, you probably do have a level-headed temperament, but here's the thing. It's not a temper, it's an autistic meltdown. This clear separation deserves an entire video on its own, so if you'd like to see that or any other topics on validating your neurodivergent life, please consider subscribing. The thing about tempers is that being mad is not the same as having a meltdown. They may look similar externally, however, internally, they differ quite a bit. See, no amount of self-control will extinguish a meltdown. Meltdowns can take the form of yelling, screaming, self-harm, or other destructive behavior. Alternatively, can take the form of a shutdown, which is similar but looks different. It could be a lot more quiet and from the outside look like a brooding silent treatment. But it's not a matter of perspective, patience, self-control, or even emotional intelligence. A lot of the time, meltdowns are ironically caused by having too much perspective, too much control, and too high of an emotional intelligence. Meltdowns are involuntary and usually can be aided with self-regulating stims and time. So the key distinction that I wanted to make is that if you treat a meltdown like it's a temper tantrum, you won't actually end up fixing anything. You'll end up being far misunderstood and probably prolong your suffering. Up next, an intense sense of justice, fairness, and equality. Have you ever been described as someone who's very stubborn, set in their ways, or does not do something simply because it's about the principle? Monetarily, this sense of justice can also be problematic. It may be really, really important to feel as though you're getting what you're paying for, but to a fault. Well, for many of us autistics, we experience safety around structure, clear expectations, predictability, and order. So when any of these core pieces are changed, abused, or even just forgotten, it feels like our safety is being threatened. Stereotypically, what I just described could be seen as black and white thinking or rigid thinking patterns. But if we strip this concept to its core, this makes perfect sense to me. If the world is louder, pointier, sharper for someone who is autistic, they'll constantly feel like they're threatened. It makes sense that feeling safe is on a higher priority than a lot of other values out there. So here are a bunch of lived examples. Behaviorally, this could be outwardly observed in the form of extremely strict observance of rules, either big or small, being an intense rule follower, an intense guideline follower, even to the point of sacrificing the enjoyment of an experience for the sake of following this established parameter. Strict observance of definitions and roles. For example, to be a good student, so-and-so should do XYZ. To be a good parent, friend, the list goes on. Or the complete opposite of everything I just said, and even rejecting social constructs and rules, rejecting authority, especially if the authority feels arbitrary. So if the authority is not based on an objective qualification, like experience, education, skill. Age is a great example of this rejected authority. Sometimes a child can completely ignore the hierarchy of respecting adults simply because to them, age is not a valid qualifying currency that grants authority. So hopefully everything that I've just explained can shed some light on why some aspects of the autistic experience may be considered taken too literally. Of course, none of these statements are infallible blanket statements that apply to everyone all the time, because again, autism is a spectrum and it doesn't affect every autistic the same way. So earlier I mentioned that I wanted to share some helpful solutions and advice that can help provide a more balanced perspective when experiencing a lot of these trickier issues. Earlier, I mentioned perfectionism. So in my head, I end up doing this cosmic calculus, finding the most perfect, optimal solution. So rather than seeing the error tolerance as an extremely thin, floss tightrope of perfection, it's helpful to imagine this path being a road as wide as the country. What I mean is increasing that potential margin of error and trying to build up a tolerance for uncertainty, spontaneity, and just unpredictable variables. And for some, that sentence might be nightmares incarnate, but I still think it's worth saying. If you're familiar with spoon theory, which is a popular analogy for a lot of neurodivergent folks to use, try to end the day with remaining spoons. Your gas tank doesn't have to be empty as evidence or proof that you worked hard enough. In college, a passing grade still gets a diploma. Thus was born the cheesy catchphrase, C's get degrees. So applying that to an autistic lifestyle, if C grade effort is enough to pass, doing so could conserve your energy for things that matter more. You'll then have the energy to give A+ effort on the things that will pay you back and bring you more value. Regarding the topic of tempers versus meltdowns, it's helpful to practice and train yourself in recognizing signs of dysregulation early on, because no matter how good or bad you are at controlling a temper, dysregulation will make things worse 100% of the time, every time. So while you can't fully control a meltdown, it's much more realistic to prevent a meltdown as often as possible. If it's within your control, take breaks, regulate when you can, and give yourself ample time to process at a reasonable pace. If the person and/or situation is safe, you could establish clear communication shortcuts to quickly give essential context without burning precious energy on things that would steal it away. For example, one really key piece of information that could be helpful to communicate is the difference between a temper tantrum and a meltdown. Generally speaking, a temper tantrum, it usually has the ulterior motive of getting something or being right, but a meltdown's goal is usually just to stop and prevent the overstimulation that's happening. And now to cover justice, fairness, and equality, for me at least, the worst parts are the constant ruminations in my head. I constantly replay the injustice and seek closure on why something happened. Was it ego, ignorance, blatant disobedience? Who knows? I end up trying to solve this unsolvable problem. And a helpful realization for me is that even if people universally agree on a moral, doesn't mean their interpretation of that structure is identical to mine. Everyone has their own manual for life. So even if they know the expectation, it doesn't mean they want to follow them, or maybe they want to, but they don't have the capacity to follow that manual. So that's a lot of variability that will feel overwhelming to grasp all at once, but it's not your job to enforce people's life manuals. A boundary is where your responsibility ends and another begins. It may seem like I'm just telling you to focus more on others encroaching on your boundaries, but what I mean to say is, if you've already passed the point of reasonable and peaceful solutions in that situation, like me, if you tend to spend a lot of time ruminating on topics that aren't solvable, you are then overstepping your own boundary and will end up being the one suffering the most out of that change in injustice. If you liked this video, like it. It actually makes a big difference. Do not forget to subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Thanks so much for watching.